Frost keeps creeping deeper into the shelter walls. 2 children haven't eaten in 3 days. The hunters, the fastest, strongest people in the tribe, stand frozen because nothing in their lives has prepared them for a winter like this. Then, an old woman slowly pushes herself to her feet. She can barely stand. But she's seen this before. Not last year, not 10 years ago, 60 winters ago. And what she does next may be the reason you're alive today. Here's the part that should stop you cold. Nature isn't supposed to let her live this long. Look almost anywhere in the animal kingdom. A female salmon fights upstream, lays her eggs, and dies. Some spider mothers are eaten by their own offspring the moment they've served their purpose. Once an animal can no longer reproduce, evolution usually stops investing in it. The body wears down. Energy is spent elsewhere. For almost every species on Earth, that's the rule. Humans broke it. A woman can live 30, 40, even 50 years after having her last child. From an evolutionary perspective, that shouldn't make sense. Evolution doesn't keep a machine running for decades after its job is done, unless the job wasn't over. For years, scientists struggled to explain why humans are different. Then, one anthropologist decided to look for the answer somewhere surprisingly ordinary. Not in a laboratory, not in a museum, but among one of the last hunter-gatherer societies still living much like our distant ancestors. Her name was Kristen Hawkes. She traveled to Tanzania to study the Hadza people. At first, the story seemed obvious. The hunters would provide the food, the young would do the hard work, the elders would simply survive on whatever the tribe could spare. Reality looked completely different. The hunters often returned with nothing. Big game is unpredictable. Some days you eat, some days you don't. But every morning, one group quietly left camp, the grandmothers. They walked into the bush carrying digging sticks. Hour after hour, they searched for underground roots buried too deep for children to reach and too time-consuming for busy mothers to collect. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't heroic, but it was reliable. Day after day, the grandmothers kept bringing food home. Not the most exciting food, not the biggest meals, just enough. And in prehistory, just enough meant everything. Then researchers noticed something even more remarkable. A grandmother doesn't simply feed her grandchildren. She gives something far more valuable: time. Without help, a mother has to spend nearly every waking hour finding enough food for herself and her child. That means fewer pregnancies, longer gaps between children, and a slower growing family. But when a grandmother steps in, everything changes. She watches the children. She gathers food. She shares decades of experience. Suddenly, the mother's free to have another child sooner, then another. One extra pair of aging hands doesn't just help a family survive, it helps that family grow. This became known as the grandmother hypothesis. And if it's true, one of the greatest forces behind human success wasn't stronger muscles, sharper spears, or bigger brains. It was grandmothers. The very people evolution seemed ready to discard turned out to be one of the greatest survival advantages our species ever developed. If you're enjoying uncovering the hidden stories that shaped humanity, consider subscribing. This channel isn't about the version of history most people know. It's about the discoveries hiding underneath it. Now here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Food wasn't the only thing our ancestors depended on. There was something even more valuable: knowledge. Remember, there were no books, no maps, no schools, no writing. Every survival lesson a tribe possessed existed in exactly one place, someone's memory. Which plants healed wounds, which berries could kill, where water hid during a drought, how to read the sky before a storm, how to survive a winter no one else had ever seen. When an elder died, it wasn't just a person the tribe lost, it was an entire library, burned to the ground. For years, that idea sounded poetic. Then scientists found evidence that it was probably true. A biological anthropologist named Rachel Kaspari wasn't searching for stories, she was studying teeth. Because teeth record age surprisingly well. As people grow older, their teeth wear down in predictable ways. By examining fossil teeth from hundreds of thousands of years ago, Kaspari could estimate how old people were when they died. And what she found was astonishing. For most of human prehistory, very few people reached grandparent age. Living long enough to become an elder wasn't normal, it was extraordinary. Then, something changed. Around 30,000 years ago, the number of older adults increased dramatically. For the first time, grandparents became a common part of human communities. And something else changed at almost exactly the same time. The archaeological records suddenly became alive. Cave paintings appeared in remarkable numbers. Jewelry became more sophisticated. Tools became increasingly complex. Burial rituals spread across different cultures. For hundreds of thousands of years, cultural change had moved at a crawl. Then suddenly, it accelerated. Scientists still debate every reason why, but one explanation is difficult to ignore. Knowledge had finally stopped dying with every generation. Young people can learn skills, but elders teach something even more powerful. They teach other people how to teach. Once that happens, knowledge no longer disappears every lifetime. It accumulates. One generation builds on the last, then the next builds even higher. That's how civilizations begin, which raises an uncomfortable question. What happened to the humans who never reached that point? Take the Neanderthals. For decades, they were portrayed as primitive cave dwellers. Today, we know that's simply wrong. They controlled fire. They crafted sophisticated stone tools. They hunted dangerous animals. They cared for injured members of their groups. Some even survived severe disabilities for years because others kept them alive. They weren't unintelligent. In fact, their brains were slightly larger than ours on average. So why did they disappear while we spread across the planet?
No one knows for certain, but Rachel Kaspari noticed something fascinating. Neanderthal fossils contain far fewer older adults than those of early modern humans. Fewer grandparents, fewer elders, fewer living libraries. Imagine discovering an incredible survival trick, only for the one person who knew it to die before teaching anyone else. Now imagine that happening generation after generation for thousands of years. Meanwhile, our ancestors kept passing knowledge forward. Each generation started a little farther ahead than the one before. Perhaps the greatest difference between us and the Neanderthals wasn't intelligence, it was memory. In the end, the species that remembered outlasted the species that forgot. Humans aren't the only species that discovered the value of growing old. Out in the open ocean, another family follows almost the same rule: killer whales. Orcas are one of the very few animals on Earth whose females regularly live for decades after they stop having offspring. From an evolutionary perspective, that shouldn't happen, unless their work isn't finished. Marine biologists have spent decades tracking orcapods through good years and bad. One pattern appears again and again. When food becomes scarce, the pod follows its oldest female. Not because she's the strongest, not because she's the fastest, because she remembers. She remembers where the salmon gathered decades earlier. She remembers which channels stayed open when the sea changed. She remembers routes the younger whales have never seen. When researchers compared different pods, they found something remarkable. Groups led by older females were far more likely to survive difficult years. Remove the matriarch, and survival rates begin to fall. It's not sentiment, it's not respect, it's evolution.
When survival depends on knowledge that only time can provide, age becomes one of the greatest advantages a species can have. And suddenly, that old woman from the beginning of our story doesn't seem unusual anymore. Picture that frozen valley again. The fire is dying, the children are weak, the hunters have exhausted every place they know, the tribe has reached the edge of disaster. Then the old woman stands, not because she's stronger than anyone else, but because memory is stronger than strength. She remembers a hidden spring that appeared during a terrible drought 60 winters earlier, a place no one else alive has ever seen. She leads the tribe there. They survive. The children survive. Those children grow up. They have children of their own, generation after generation, until, eventually, someone is born who will become you. That's why this isn't just a story about one remarkable grandmother. It's a story about every grandmother who came before us, every elder who remembered, every parent who listened, every child who learned. Your instinct to slow down when an older person begins telling a story, to protect aging parents, to value the wisdom of grandparents, may not simply be culture. It may be one of the oldest survival programs ever written into the human mind. For hundreds of thousands of years, tribes that cared for their elders consistently outlived tribes that didn't, not because kindness made them morally better, but because it made them better survivors. Compassion wasn't a luxury, it was an evolutionary advantage. And perhaps that's the most surprising lesson of all. The people who seemed the least useful quietly became the foundation of everything humanity would eventually build.
Our greatest inheritance wasn't passed down through stronger bodies or sharper weapons. It was passed down through memory, through teaching, through experience, through people who had already lived long enough to know what the young could not. Maybe that's why evolution broke one of its oldest rules, because sometimes the future doesn't belong to the strongest. It belongs to the ones who remember. And if we forget the value of those who came before us, we risk losing far more than stories. We risk losing the very advantage that made us human. Thanks for watching. This is StickVerse, and we'll see you in the next one.